what can we do to prevent such abuse most of all. For example, we know that from the law enforcement intelligence that some of the countries are seeing rise and increases around the financial extortions that is affecting especially boys during their teenage years. So this is, for example, and it's one of the latest developments being, and I would expect that in the next few years, this slide will change. The phenomenon is changing extremely fast, and that's one of the challenges. And next slide, please, Esmeralda. Yes, so the good news is that we are not starting from scratch. We have a lot of frameworks and systems already that we can refer to. There's been a lot of work in terms of developing technology solutions that can support us to both prevent and respond to this issue. But one of the key challenges that we are still facing as a community is the lack of data and evidence. And you see that on this slide I've highlighted, we need to learn how children are being exposed to these risks and harms, and how, and which children are most vulnerable, but also what countries are doing already, what is in place and what is needed, because this varies quite significantly depending on the region or the country. Next slide, please. This is, just an overview, a map showing where we have invested so far in this field. You see that we have invested 76 million in total in 95 projects across 80 countries. Next slide, please. So I showed you the map, just to give you a little bit more of a sense of what we're doing. We are a pooled fund. So basically we bring funds from different donors together to invest them in different countries and regions around 3 priorities areas. One is technology solutions, one is system strengthening, which basically means supporting countries to improve their systems at country level to both prevent and respond to abuse. And the third pillar is what I was referring to, is the generation of evidence and data. To identify how the phenomenon is evolving in different contexts, what are the threats, what are the trends. And we have invested, out of the 76 million that I shared before, approximately 35 have gone to system strengthening, 50 million to technology, and around 20 million to evidence and data. Next slide, please. You see, so this is one of our main pillars of our work, and the reasons why as a donor we have invested so much in data and evidence generation is because mainly, to be very blunt, is, how do we know where to invest and what interventions are most effective if we do not understand the phenomena, if we do not understand the risks or the protective factors. So this is mainly why we are investing in this, but also because we know that if the interventions and the projects we are funding are evidence-based, we know that they will have a much more chances for impact to protect the children. Next slide, please. So evidence and data is not just research and, studies or documents or publications that we can put on a shelf. The evidence and data can generate a lot of momentum at country level, but also beyond. We have seen, for example, that can generate political will in different contexts, can catalyze action, but can also, have impact across beyond the specific countries where we're investing to generate the information. And for example, as I said before, it can generate more resources, which is actually very much lacking in this field. There is a big need for more financial investments, and they've seen that when we invest in evidence generation, then that investment it can promote what we refer to as co-funding, can generate more investments. Next slide, please. So one of our flagship projects, which Daniel is going to talk to you more about today, is Disrupting Harm. I don't know if you're familiar with the project, but this is the large-scale project that's been implemented already in 13 countries for a total of 7 million in Southeast Asia and Southern and Eastern Africa. The second round is starting now, basically in 12 additional countries across 4 additional regions. The project is implemented by ECPAT, Interpol, and UNICEF Innocenti. So it's a partnership of different organizations that bring in different expertises to develop a new methodology and to basically assess the way that this phenomenon is manifesting at country level, but also to provide specific roadmaps for each country to address the needs at country level. So I remember, I joined the team at the End Violence Partnership in 2018, and this was one of the first projects we worked on. And we identified these 3 partners based on their expertise. ECPAT is an NGO with the strong expertise around sexual exploitation and abuse. Interpol, of course, is leading the global work around law enforcement, and UNICEF Innocenti comes with great experience around, gathering information and evidence from children directly. So it was not, was not an easy task for the partners to bring their expertise together, to develop a new methodology, and also to pilot it across 2 regions. And especially they did it also during COVID. However, we are very grateful for all the efforts from these 3 leading organizations. And this is also why, based on the success of the first pilot, we have invested an additional 7.5 million. Next slide, please. So why are we investing so much in this, and why we as a donor, we feel the evidence generation is so important? This is not just about data and research. This is something that can really bring change at country level, can facilitate knowledge exchanges and a better understanding of the phenomena at global regional level, and therefore inform advocacy efforts, can show cross-country trends and patterns, because the methodology is replicable, is comparable. And we hope that this is bringing, it's building a baseline that we can continue to build together to bring light to the way this phenomenon is manifesting. And most important, as a donor, we need to know where to invest. So thanks to Disrupting Harm, for example, we have invested an additional 10 million. Next slide, please. I think it's coming. I mean, this is actually an example of one of the changes that came out of Disrupting Harm. Malaysia, I think 3 weeks ago, the parliament approved significant amendments to the sexual offense bill. And these were informed basically by the Disrupting Harm recommendations. This is a big achievement, and it's not the only country. We know that Indonesia, Kenya, Tanzania, and also the regional ASEAN Association in Southeast Asia is already using Disrupting Harm recommendations and findings to inform policies, national action plans, to create cross-sector groups to work on this. So this is just an example of how the evidence can inform actual significant change. And I'm sure Daniel can tell you more about this and details about this. Next slide, please. This is what I was mentioning before. It's not just about investing in data and evidence, it's also about supporting change based on that evidence generation. So once Disrupting Harm was concluded in the first 13 countries, we have invested 10 million more around these 3 areas that were identified from the project of priorities, which is strengthening national infrastructures, focusing on early intervention and basic support, and engaging with families and caregivers. And as I mentioned earlier, this 10 million generated 6 million co-funding. So this is what I was saying, data and research and evidence is not just that, it's a lot more. It can bring more resources, it can bring change across levels. Next slide, please. This is just another example of some evidence generation that we're doing specifically with the Technology Coalition. I believe most of you will be familiar with it. This is the group of the tech giants that came together to coordinate their work around tackling child online sexual abuse and exploitation. This research fund has already invested around 2 million in 13 projects in total. The specificity of this research project is they're looking specifically of identifying data and evidence that can support actionable changes for what the industry can do. So the research studies are looking specifically at prevention, deterrence, detection, reporting, response, and support, and specifically looking on the role of industry. And if you want to learn more about these projects, the information is on the website. Next slide, please. Just to conclude, as I was saying before, there is a huge need for data and evidence generation in this field. Sometimes I felt and I'm sure I'm not the only one, that we were a little bit walking in the dark. The phenomenon is changing very fast. We belong to a generation that is not They was not growing up with digital technologies. Internet penetration is also increasing in different countries, and we've seen the phenomenon changing and being very different depending on the different contexts. And when we got together, we brought together a community of actors that are working in this field from different sectors in November in Brussels. We were looking at how the overall data ecosystem is working to identify the key gaps and what are the needs in terms of, better coordination, better collection and analysis of data, better opportunity for sharing and use, but most of all for responsible use of data, because we realize that often there is misunderstanding or barriers or difficulties in actually talking about this issue because we are not very clear on how it's happening. We will continue this initiative, and we are now commissioning a further landscape analysis, and we should be able to provide more insights around September, but we'll also be happy to share more information if you would like to. Next slide, please. This is the last point from my side. This is just to remind us all the link between evidence and data generation and knowledge with advocacy and change, as I was mentioning before. On the screen, you can see other examples of research that we have funded. For example, the recent study that was published around what works to prevent online violence against children conducted by WHO. There is also a baseline study done across more than 40 countries by the Council of Europe, or a in-depth analysis from UNICEF. And these type of research evidence really support us in our advocacy efforts at different levels. On the screen, you see work that we have been doing with the UN Roadmap for Digital Cooperation or with the Broadband Commission. And just now we are ready to submit a joint submission for the UN Digital Compact around how children's rights should be applied online. There is still an opportunity to sign up to this joint submission if you'd like to. We have around 40 organizations, so if you would like to do so, please be in touch. Next slide, please. This is my email address. We are happy to provide more information, and thanks for your attention. I would like to pass it to Daniel, that is going to actually tell you what disrupting harm, what this investment has told us from across 13 countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Serena. I'm very happy to be here, and I also want to thank InHope for inviting us to speak here today. I'm really excited always to talk about our work on disrupting harm. It is a unique research project. It's focused on online sexual abuse of children. And as you heard Serena say, it's conducted in partnership by UNICEF, by ECPAT International and Interpol, and of course funded by the Safe Online initiative that Serena represents. So given the progress of digital development globally, it's really important for all societies to understand more about how children's lives are influenced by digital transformation, both in terms of what they are experiencing in the digital environment itself, but also how their lives might be influenced more broadly as a result of digitalization, and what this digitalization means for different functions or institutions in society that children come into contact with. So, for example, what does it mean for children if crimes are committed against them in the digital environment, but the national legislation, law enforcement, or justice sectors are not sufficiently up to date to prosecute such crimes? Or what does it mean if the people who are meant to protect and support children don't even recognize online crimes as real crimes because what just happened online rather than in the physical environment? This is a reality for many children around the world today. Online sexual abuse is not always fully accounted for in national legislation. It is not always fully understood by society, by people. It's not properly managed by institutions meant to serve children's needs. And so, as a result, more children are at risk of harm and may not receive support that they need if they're victimized. Now, what is disrupting harm? And how does it relate to what I just said? Well, in brief, Disrupting Harm is a research project that produces national assessments of the threat of online child sexual abuse, alongside an assessment of how society and the national protection systems are responding to this crime. And so it provides a roadmap for countries to help them update their systems, upskill their workforce in response to the digital transformation of society and its impact on children. So in that sense, the project produces evidence on the world of the child and the experiences that they have as children growing up with and around technology. But it also produces evidence on the world around the child, the institutions that they come into contact with and the systems that that are meant to support them through life. And these are really important influences, of course, on their lives, on their well-being. If you move to the next slide, please. So you see on the screen here, the 13 countries in Africa and Asia where we worked in the first round of disrupting harm research. In my presentation today, I'll be referring to evidence from these countries only. However, and if you go to the next slide, as Serena said, we are starting a second round of implementation in 12 new countries, Latin America, Middle East, Eastern Europe, and South Asia. Those countries will be announced later in the year, but that's not the evidence I'm referencing in this presentation, just to be clear. You can move to the next slide. So I'm not going to talk a lot about methods, but what I want to emphasize here, and what is really unique about this project, and also its most challenging aspect, is that we combine many different sources of data and triangulate them to provide a really comprehensive picture of the situation in country. So just for example, and this is what you see on the slide, we implement nationally representative household surveys with children and parents to generate data about their experiences of online sexual abuse and other things they do online as well. We conduct a range of qualitative research activities with different duty bearers, like government officials, justice professionals, frontline workers, as well as survivors of online sexual abuse. And we also engage with law enforcement to conduct a capacity assessment, try to access case files, case data where available, and all of this is underpinned by a comprehensive review of the legislation. So in a way, Disrupting Harm is like 7 research projects in one that we implement across multiple countries at the same time. Always happy to go into more detail if there are questions relating to the methods, but I think the bottom line is that as far as social science research goes, in my view, this is very comprehensive. It really puts children at the center, and it takes a lot of time and effort to get it right. You can go to the next slide. So today I'm going to go into some of our findings and results from Disrupting Harm. Of course, what I'm able to present to you today is only a small fraction of the data we have. I'm going to provide you with findings that for the most part cuts across most or all of the countries where we did this work. But having said that, in some cases, there are very clear and important differences between countries, and I'll call those out when they exist. But there's much more that you can find in each of the national reports we have produced for this project and the data insights, which are like thematic research briefs. One thing to note is that in the Disrupting Harm household survey, where a lot of the data I'll present is from, we speak to children aged 12 to 17 who use the internet. That is the group that we can make claims about. We don't have data from younger children. I'll be saying children throughout this presentation, but what I actually mean is children aged 12 to 17 who use the internet. Just keep that in mind. So just for a bit of context for these countries, through Disrupting Harm, we're able to estimate the proportion of children who use the internet in each of the countries where we work. This kind of data is actually quite rare, even though you might not think so in this day and age, but unfortunately it is. What we see here across these regions in particular is that children living in the countries in Southeast Asia, they're mostly very well connected, whereas children in the African countries are a bit less so. What's important to note, and a bit of myth busting perhaps, is that even in countries with relatively lower internet access, children's exposure to online risks and online sexual abuse can be just as high. So I think there's a bit of a misconception that internet access in and of itself drives exposure to online harms, which means that children in high connectivity countries would always be more vulnerable. But what we find in our research is that it's not quite that simple. So just as an example, the Philippines had the highest rate of online child sexual abuse in our research, while also having the highest internet penetration rate for children. And that seems logical, right? But then Uganda has a second highest rate of online child sexual abuse, while only having around 40% of its children connected. And Thailand is right in the middle of the pack in terms of online risk, even though almost all children in Thailand are connected. So internet access does not appear to be the most critical factor in terms of driving exposure to online child sexual abuse or online risks more broadly. We are working on some new analysis now using a larger 35 country data set, where we see some indications that once a country hits about a 50% internet adoption rate, there seems to be a noticeable increase in online risk exposure for children. And what that means is that especially in current low connectivity settings, governments and industry should really consider implementing strong child online protection policies and practices now to try to mitigate the spike in online risks that seems to occur once a majority of the country is connected. You can go to the next slide. So interestingly, children seem to engage in largely the same activities online, irrespective of where in the world they're from. They spend time on social media, which is what you see on the slide. They watch videos, they watch streams, they search for information, they use it for schoolwork. It is very consistent across lots of research, including Disrupting Harm, but also from Europe, from the United States, that these are the kind of main activities for children. You see here the proportion of children in each country that uses social media at least once a week or more often. The results are pretty much the same for different kind of instant messaging apps. There are considerable differences between countries, but just like with internet access, social media use in and of itself does not seem to be the driving factor behind why children experience online risks, though it certainly contributes. You can go to the next slide. In terms of some specific risks that children experience online in these countries, the first risk I'll talk about is unwanted exposure to sexual content. I say unwanted because we see in our data that a considerable proportion of children actually seek out sexual content for different reasons. This is not what we're talking about here. This is unwanted exposure, accidental exposure for the most part. So you can go to the next slide. And across the 13 countries where we did this research, on average, 1/3 of children came across sexual content unexpectedly in the past year alone. And this is an estimate that is fairly similar actually across countries. When asked where they came across this content, most of them said that it happened on social media, but around 30% said that it happened through advertisements, 25% via direct messages, and 20% via search engines. And this obviously has some pretty clear implications for industry actors, because these are channels where service providers have a lot of control. And while recognizing the challenges with content moderation and reporting, this is still an area where it should be possible to do better. Where industry has perhaps a bit less control is in relation to self-generated sexual content. You can go to the next slide. And so these would be images or videos that children create themselves and sometimes share with others. So across these 13 countries, we found that on average, around 6% of children had taken sexual images or videos of themselves in the past year, and 6% had shared sexual images online with other people. These numbers are fairly similar to what we see in research from European countries. It's a bit lower than the most recent figures I've seen from the United States. The most common reason for sharing such images were because children were in love, they were flirting, they were having fun. But in a few cases, they did so because they were threatened or because they were afraid of losing an important relationship if they did not share these kinds of images. So some of what we see here or capture here is likely consensual, some seems to be non-consensual. Obviously, sharing sexual images can be risky and lead to harmful outcomes, even though children might have understandable reasons for doing it. Next slide, please. We can also see in our data that around 17% of children experienced some form of sexual harassment online, and 16% said that someone sent them unwanted sexual images, and both of these are in the past year only. This too is roughly in line with other studies from the United States, from Europe, suggesting that children's experiences of online risk in Africa and Asia may not be that different from other parts of the world. And of course, there are regions where we still need to do this research. Our research showed that a large proportion of children who received unwanted sexual images did so via social media, which is a really important finding for the industry to consider. Mostly, all of these online risks that I've talked about, they were more common amongst older children. That also matches research from Europe. However, it was fairly equal for boys and girls, and this cuts across All of the risks and harms we find in our research and online sexual abuse experiences as well. There's a broad lack of gender differences for this particular age range that we're studying, which sometimes surprises people to hear. I do want to flag that the numbers that I've presented so far, they're averages across all of the countries included in our study. But there are considerable differences, like I said before, between the countries. Some have much higher exposure to different forms of risks than others. You'll see that soon on the next slide. But this really emphasizes the importance of conducting in-depth national level research like Disrupting Harm does, so that countries can put in place a response based on data that speaks to their particular context, captures the experiences of children in a particular country. Now, before going into the numbers about online sexual abuse in particular, which is perhaps the most severe form of online risk that children experience, I want to clarify what we mean by online sexual abuse in this study, because there is often a bit of confusion around this concept. So people sometimes think of online sexual abuse only as experiences that children have in the digital environment. For example, if a child is groomed or sexually harassed on social media. But we believe when we did this work that this alone is not really comprehensive enough to capture all the ways in which digital technology facilitates sexual abuse of children. So for example, the act of taking private or sexual images of someone else without consent using a phone camera and then threatening or extorting them with those images, we consider that a form of online abuse as well, even though it mostly happens in person, but through the use of technology. And we believe this distinction is really important because whether something happens purely on a digital platform or purely in the physical world, or both overlapping together, it has major implications in terms of who is best placed to prevent and respond to it. And the more we know about where and how online sexual abuse happens, the more precise can we be in our response to it, and the more carefully can we allocate responsibility to certain actors to prevent it. And that is why for us in this study, online sexual abuse is defined quite broadly as situations of abuse that involve digital communication technology at some point during the abuse, but it doesn't need to happen exclusively in the digital environment. Now, having said all that, we have produced national level estimates on online sexual abuse of children, which you can see if you go to the next slide. Now, these estimates, they capture severe experiences of online sexual abuse that are always harmful to a child. What you see here, and I really want to emphasize this, they're very conservative estimates, only of the most serious forms of online sexual abuse. It's things like having your sexual images shared online without consent. It's being threatened or extorted online to engage in sexual acts, being offered money or gifts in return for sex or sexual images or videos. And the estimate you see here is based on children's experiences in the past year only. It's not a lifetime estimate. It's the proportion of children who experience any of these things in the past year. So you can see that the estimates range between 1 to 20%. There are some considerable differences here between countries. And by and large, that also pertains to all of the online risks that I've talked about previously. The countries with a higher estimate of online child sexual abuse also have higher estimates for all online risks. I want to caveat this slide a little bit by saying that we believe the estimates for Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia are significantly underreported. Actually, we believe all of these estimates to be somewhat underreported, because that's almost always the case when studying sexual violence. But for those three countries, we believe that the kind of direct inquiry with children around experiences of online sexual abuse might have been a bit too difficult, and it might have led to more underreporting. And so possibly in these countries, we need additional ways to understand children's experiences of sexual violence, online as well as offline. But in any case, the precise estimate is not really the most important thing here. What matters is that we get a sense of the approximate proportion of children who experience online sexual abuse in these countries. And we can tell that these numbers are really very high, given the severity of the experiences and that it happened only in the previous year, and because we were very conservative when we calculated these statistics. And despite all that, if we extrapolate these numbers to the total population of internet using children in each country, our results show that hundreds of thousands or even millions of children, depending on the country, experience online sexual abuse every year. You can go to the next slide. On this slide, you can see the most common perpetrator of online sexual abuse per country, according to what children are telling us. Again, there are differences between countries. In a few countries, strangers are the most common perpetrator. In most countries, though, it's friends or someone else that the child already knew from before. They can be people who are over or under 18 years of age. It's similar to some research we've seen coming out of the United States recently. We need to do much more research on perpetrators to understand in more detail who perpetrates these kinds of crimes against children, and to be able to distinguish between different perpetrators and their respective motivations for offending. And again, this slide exemplifies why we think national prevention and education programs need to be data-driven from national data, tailored to the country context. Awareness messaging and protective measures in countries where unknown people, strangers, are the most common perpetrator need to look a bit different compared to countries where perpetrators are more likely to be, for example, someone the child already knows from before. We found that children, particularly younger children aged 12 and 13, were reluctant to answer questions about perpetrators. Up to 1 in 3 children who participated in the survey preferred not to identify the perpetrator or answer that question. And this shows some of the challenges in relying exclusively on surveys with children to get data on perpetrators, and why data from other sources can be really helpful. Yeah, overall, what these data suggest is that we probably need more and different kind of research to understand different forms of offending, and overall get a better grasp on the presumably different motivations for offending that people may have. You can go to the next slide. So I'll end my presentation now with some brief additional insights into children's experiences of online sexual abuse. First, we've learned that over half of children who experience online sexual abuse said that it happened on social media. In some countries, that number is a lot higher as well. Social media is a really important part of children's lives. It's a space where they spend a lot of time. There's a lot of good things happening on social media. However, our findings really show that social media companies have to step up their game in terms of prevention and for providing support to children who are victimized. A very large majority of these cases happen on Meta platforms. That would be Facebook, Instagram, or WhatsApp. In some cases, up to 90% of the online child sexual abuse cases in a country that occurs on social media. Children are remarkably consistent in their reports on this. Most children who experience online sexual abuse, they've also experienced sexual violence in person. We think that this is likely because many acts of in-person violence today will inevitably involve digital technology at some stage. But equally, it could also be that children who are more vulnerable to in-person sexual violence are also more vulnerable to online violence and online sexual abuse. Unpublished analysis that we'll share soon demonstrates quite clear linkages between online sexual abuse and negative mental health outcomes. So children who experience online sexual abuse, they're between 2 to 4 times more likely to report that they self-harmed or had suicidal thoughts in the past year compared to those children who did not experience online sexual abuse. And this is irrespective of whether they experienced any form of in-person sexual abuse, which shows that online abuse can have potentially cumulative negative effects. And finally, and sadly, you can go to the next slide, we've learned that around 1 in 3 children who experience online sexual abuse did not tell anyone about this experience. When children do disclose to others, they mostly tend to talk to friends or siblings, sometimes to their caregivers. But very few children formally report to helplines or the police, which means that a lot of these cases go unreported. They're not captured in formal law enforcement data, nor are criminals necessarily identified and prosecuted, and children may not receive the support that they're entitled to. Of course, we've also learned through qualitative research in Disrupting Harm with survivors of online sexual abuse that even when children formally report, it is not always a great experience for them due to shortcomings in the justice system or in the law enforcement or social service response. So all that to say, we still have some ways to go in terms of understanding how helplines, how law enforcement can become more viable options for children who experience online sexual abuse. And I think there's an open challenge in there also for online service providers and platform owners to consider how they might facilitate such reporting and help children seek support when needed. And that concludes my presentation about Disrupting Harm. I hope it was interesting. I hope it was relevant for your work. As Serena said, the research continues in another 12 countries this year by UNICEF, ECPAT, and Interpol, and with the End Violence Fund. So we continue to build up this evidence base over time, and hopefully we can already next year share some new insights from different countries, different regions of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Serena, for this incredibly interesting presentation. I would like to remind all participants that they can ask questions. If you want to ask Serena or Daniel a question, please put it in the Q&A chat. I see some questions coming in. People are very interested in the presentation itself, if they can perhaps receive this presentation over email or if the slides are available.
I can respond to that if you want.
Yeah.
We usually don't make the slides available. And the reason why we don't is because there are basically a lot of numbers on these slides. They're not attached to my presentation and what I say, and it's quite easy to misuse numbers as such. And so we just want to be very careful with the slides. But there are reports, data, insights, summary briefs that contain most of this information in a written up format, which you could access, but I'm sorry about that.
Okay. No worries. We will always also publish a recap article of this webinar, and it is also recorded, so will be published online for anyone wanting to view this again. Thank you, Daniel, for answering that question. I see a question here. Any insight on how these trends relate to the observable world increase in human trafficking? I don't know who the question is for, but Daniel or Serena, could you answer this one?
I cannot really comment to that. It's not my area of expertise. I think it's clear that online sexual abuse is in different ways potentially related to human trafficking, but those relationships I have not studied, so I don't feel competent to answer. It's a good question.
Okay.
Yeah, likewise, I think it's a good question. I think ECPAT, one of the partners, is implementing Disrupting Harm with us and with the Innocenti and Interpol will be best placed to reply to that question. And if you're interested, we can totally connect with them to check. Also, Daniel, this could be something to take back to Disrupting Harm partners. And this is something also I wanted to mention earlier. As we are, as the partners, they are defining the methodology based on the first pilot to conduct it again in 12 countries. We are open for, recommendations, feedback. We are having conversation with different actors, including the industry, to see what type of data is most useful to them, what was missing from the first round, what we should be adding, and so on. And in relation to the question about the PowerPoint, even if Daniel, as he said, he prefers to share the slide, all the data is available on the website, and I can put the link in the chat. You will find national reports which have very detailed, nationally specific information across the different areas. including the recommendations, but also something called the Data Insight Series, which basically provides the cross-analysis of the findings across 13 countries around different themes. Could be access to justice, could be children's experiences, law enforcement, offenders' behaviors and pathways. So I can add the link to the chat in a second.
Yep, that would be great, Serena. I think that also answers the question whether or not this research is being published or if it will be published.
It is already published. I'm going to add the link. It's all available. You can access it. And the overall idea is that, you know, this is for all of you to use and refer to. I see also another question about what would be the best way to implement those changes so children would feel more comfortable to report from a point of view. This is a very important question. This is something I think me and Daniel agree a lot, and we have exchanged a lot. There is a lot of attention to the lack of reporting, and sometimes often, you know, too much stress on children, on the expectation for them to report. And I think it can be actually unethical to push children to report unless adults and the system is ready to respond to their report. You know, unless service providers, you know, children, adults, you know, parents, or teachers or doctors or whoever is around the child that it was to receive that report is able to respond appropriately, it can be actually really uncomfortable with children. I think Disrupting Harms shows that some of the children had really bad experiences in the system, and this is also why they didn't report. So my direct answer to what we can do to help them to report is to strengthen the system that is going to receive the report, and also invest in the parents' ability to understand the risks, to understand the digital environment, and to talk to children in a non-judgmental way, to create this trusting relationship that will enable the child to feel confident and safe to share the type of information, and to teach parents or adults on how to receive that that report with basically, you know, no judgment, and to enable them to also find solutions. I don't know if Daniel wants to add anything to this, but it's one of the, you know, the things that we feel strongly about.
Okay. I have a question for Daniel. Can you elaborate a bit more about how the national estimates of online child sexual abuse are calculated?
I can, and thanks, Lorleen, for the question. It's good to see you on the webinar. So, okay, so without being too technical, basically the estimate that we report on here, it's a combination of 4 indicators that we measure. So these are, like I mentioned before, having your sexual images shared online without consent. It's being threatened or extorted online to engage in sexual acts, being offered money or gifts in return for sexual images or videos, and having that happen to you either online or in person. So it's those are the key estimates, and if a child has experienced any one of these, then we consider them as having experienced online sexual abuse. The reason why I say that this is a conservative estimate is because we are not here including a lot of the cases of suspected grooming, for example, that you see. I'm still not sure if that was the best choice or not. We had reasons for not doing that. Basically, we couldn't ascertain with 100% certainty whether requests, for example, to talk about sex or things like that were actually a result of nefarious grooming or not, or whether it was more of a kind of peer-on-peer relational thing. For Disrupting Harm 2, we might revise how we do these calculations. If we had included the suspected grooming cases, the estimates would be a fair bit higher. We went back and forth a lot on this one, and I'm still not sure it was the right call. But again, the overall estimate, I think, is really not the most important thing. It's actually breaking down the experiences, which we do in the national report, is probably a bit more useful, and actually we should probably do that for future webinars as well. But thank you for the question.
Thank you, Daniel. We have a lot of questions coming in. Let me have a look. Do you have the data or the outcome of the study that was conducted in South Africa from Disrupting Harm?
It's published. It's published online as well, and I think if Serena gave the link, it will be available there.
Okay, it's the same link. Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Have you seen any relation between online sexual abuse and CSAM markets? I don't know who the question is for, but.
I mean, I would guess, without knowing exactly what's referred to as CSAM markets, I would suppose that there is a link here. We do look at things like whether children sell sexual images and videos online. I didn't present that data here today, which, it seems like that would fall into CSAM market. We haven't done any deeper analysis of that. It's an interesting question, but nothing I can really comment on right away.
Yeah. Okay, another question. What is the gaming role in these challenges in your point of view?
That's an interesting one, and I say that because I love computer games. And I think they're great spaces for children to learn a lot of really useful things. However, after having done this research, we do see that gaming spaces is a space where children experience online sexual abuse. It's not as frequent as on social media, but then again, gaming sites and social media sites are becoming a bit more intertwined these days anyway. It's definitely a space where things like these happen. So gaming companies also need to be aware of this issue and start putting in place serious safeguards. Yeah, it's detailed as well in national reports, the proportion of children who experience this on gaming sites or within games.
Yeah. Another question. When comparing percentages of children using digital technology or social media across countries, how do you account for the differences in population? And is the percentage always in proportion to the population, or is it somehow adjusted to be comparable with countries of different sizes?
Yeah, it's proportional in relation to the internet use. It's a proportion of the internet using population, basically. We have a lot of really interesting data on the proportion of children who use the internet in the whole country, which we could use to do a whole lot more work on. But it hasn't been transformed in that way. It's, in a way, you could see it as a naturally evolving random sample where, we basically speak to, we find the true proportion of internet using children within the country, and that's the sample that we use for almost all of our analyses. So the numbers are comparable across countries, even though the populations differ. Sorry if that got technical.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for the answer. Can you talk about where your findings differ from what we know about traditional or offline child sexual exploitation and abuse?
So this is an interesting one, and Serena, and I don't know, Serena, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I can take it. I mean, obviously, Daniel, you could as well. It's a very interesting question, because it's one of the things that, we have been debating a lot, and how the difference in the linkages between these forms of abuse. And I think, and Daniel, correct me if I'm wrong, the stopping harm is confirmed the strong interlinkages between these two forms of abuse. Children that are more vulnerable to violence in person are equally more vulnerable to those facilitated by digital technologies. We have actually created data inside, but I didn't share the link on. It's already on the webpage. The link I shared is specifically looking at this. And it's particularly important also to understand this in terms of what I was saying earlier. If we, with the data and evidence we're generating about how the two are intersecting, then, we can better inform investments, interventions. Because I think one of the bigger risks that we have seen at country level, especially, is that people tend to interpret the offline, online as two separate worlds, which actually is not the case. The offline, online world are basically the same for the children, and very often children that are subject to violence in person are also subject to violence online. So I will strongly recommend anyone working in this field to look at available evidence on what works to prevent violence and see how this can be adapted to also tackling other forms of abuse. Obviously, certain forms of abuse perpetrated with the use of digital technologies, they do require specific tools or approaches that before were not needed. You know, the main component around online that before didn't exist is the global, you know, the cross-national, the no borders kind of aspect, but also the fast changing nature. But other aspects are very common in terms of taboos, lack of reporting, the fact that in majority of the cases, the child already knows the abuser. I think disrupting harm approximate percentage is 60% of children already knows the abuser. So, you know, I will send a link to the specific data insight, but it's a very interesting question. I hope I answered. Thank you.
Can I just jump in quickly on this one, because it's
Yes.
something I care a lot about. And this was one of my main research interests when we started disrupting harm. I think in general, there are few differences, but there aren't as many as you might think, like Serena said. I'm going to repeat what Serena said, basically. But I think the key here is that we want to build systems that in general are just able to support children, you know, strong justice sectors, strong social support networks, stronger law enforcement that can really help meet children where they are. Then we have to understand when and why we need different skills or knowledge or tools to deal with the online aspect, whatever that is, that differs depending on the crime. But that I think is really important, and that we don't create these parallel tracks. And I think the WHO review that was funded by Violence on what works to prevent online child sexual exploitation and abuse has quite interesting information on this as well, and it details this in quite a nice way. Sorry, thank you for that question. It's a very interesting one.
Thank you for the elaborate answer, both of you. I think I have one question left. That is very good question, actually. Would it be a good idea to have hotlines, reporting sites accessible to direct reporting from children? Because as you mentioned, children are very unlikely to report to helplines or police themselves. But should hotlines create their report sites in a child-friendly manner to make it easier for children to report and seek help?
Yeah, I mean, generally, you know, we are actually funding a couple of organizations to test and pilot certain ways that, you know, technology tools that can facilitate for children to report. One, for example, is called Acelo, that is being developed by Tech Mothers and tested in a couple of countries in South Asia. And it's basically a chat platform that works via Messenger or WhatsApp to basically provide support to children and basically facilitate access to helplines. So it's not specifically for hotlines, it's more for helplines. Because, you know, we know that children nowadays, they don't use the phone. You know, children don't pick up and call anyone, they just text. So basically what this organization is doing is basically trying to modernize helplines, to make them more accessible to children. Another project we have is being tested in India from the India Population Fund. And again, they have developed a chat box that provides information and gives children direct access to support for this specific type of abuse. So this could be tested for hotlines. You know, that's one option that could be totally could be looked at. But generally speaking, yes, anything that is developed for children should be designed with children. You know, I think one of the main the main problems that we have is sometimes adults, they tend to design children with their own mindset without asking the kids, you know, what they want, what they need, and what they will be happy to use. And I think that's key. So if anyone was going to test that out, I will definitely highly recommend to involve children in the design and the implementation, and also to keep us posted, because we are very interested in innovative approaches to this, and we are open, you know, for conversations also in terms of funding. Over.
Can you share some examples of those chat reporting tools you just mentioned?
Yes, I can send you the information on the website. One is called Acelo, and is managed by Tech Mothers, and the other one is managed by the India Population Foundation, I think it's called. I can share the links now. I can also share them, you know, with the follow-up summary that we're going to share after the webinar, if you think it's better, Esmeralda.
Yes, both are fine. Thank you for that. Let me see. Is there any collaboration between your organization and others, especially in this case, law enforcement, financial institutions, and regulators to combat this crime? Because the ultimate goal of online child sexual exploitation and abuse is for financial gains, which leads to money laundering.
We do, this again is an interesting question. Financial institutions have been collaborating on this for a good number of years, I think 15 years now. I think one of the challenges there, so there is partnership, there is something happening. I think one of the challenges they're having is that nowadays the perpetrators, they change means of payment very quickly. They migrate between different platforms and very quickly they change means of payments. So that's one of the critical challenges. In terms of regulators, yes, we are talking with regulators as well. This is part of the work that we have been doing with the Broadband Commissions for Sustainable Development. And also, I actually had a call with ITU this morning because they're hosting the Regulator Summit in June in Egypt. And there will be a specific session there on child online protection, which is the second time that is brought to the regulators' attention. So yes, there are partnerships ongoing with this type of organizations. And if you would like to learn more, we are available to talk more. Over.
Thank you. One question about legislation and perhaps if there's a need to lobby more to support lawmaking to protect children. Legislation in Europe protecting children is not as developed yet, let alone let alone the legislation in underdeveloped countries. Do you think there should be more use of the budget to lobby for these for more laws?
And Daniel, please step in on this. I mean, I shared the example of Malaysia, which was, for us, it was a great achievement, and we were very, very happy to see that. I think that's a great example of evidence-informed legislative change. So basically, Malaysia took up on distracting harm findings and recommendations and basically quickly amended their legislation. One of the big challenges around legislation is that usually they change very slowly. All the processes around legislation that were developed and designed for a world without digital technologies is that the changes are very slow. And also, the implementation sometimes in different contexts can be a real challenge. But, Malaysia is a good example that actually the change can happen fast. The situation at the EU level, we have been following, we have been supporting the dialogue. The EU is taking the lead in shaping the legislative environment around protection of data and the protection of children and child online safety in that context is being currently debated across the Council and the Parliament, and we are following very closely. I think what is happening is that we are making history because we're trying to use laws to basically regulate a new world, and this world is evolving fast. So we're not saying that this is easy, but we are saying that efforts are there, and we are strongly advocating for the safety of children to be balanced with the privacy. Obviously, we do care for the privacy and we support the protection of privacy, but at the same time, there must be a way for experts and regulators and legislations to find a balance and enabling, for organizations, law enforcement to be able to remove the material from the web so children are not continuing to be victimized in the respect of also the privacy of children. Over.
I think we have time for just one more question because we're running a bit over time already. This is in respect of regulators. Do you know if national financial institutions, as a matter of practice, will prioritize information relating to international CSAM and share or request data with their international counterparts with haste?
This is a very interesting question. We discussed this at the event I mentioned earlier today, earlier when we was presenting. We brought together 40 experts, including people from the financial sector, from the industry finance sector, to discuss how the data ecosystem is working, how information is prioritized, exchanged, analyzed, and cross-referenced. Esmeralda, I can share with you the brief of that event because, it gives like a bit more like a overlook, like a macro review that relates to this question. And the good thing is that we, as I said, we are commissioning a landscape analysis, which will look also at this, and we expect the findings to be ready by September. And those will be public, and we will convene again the community to further discuss. But, you know, this is to say that there is work ongoing to better understand how the ecosystem is working across different levels, including the finance sector, to better identify ways that we can better harmonize the collection and use of data to better facilitate understanding of the issue, but also inform interventions and investments.
Thank you so much for answering the questions, and thank you everyone who asked questions as well. I would like to thank you both, Serena and Daniel, for your time and for this incredibly interesting webinar. Thank you for sharing the results of your research. I would like to thank everyone for joining, and see you all hopefully next time for our next Expert Insights webinar. This will take place on May 3rd, and we'll have the guest speakers from InHope, Abby Roberts and Kalina Zografska, who will be presenting a deep dive into the InHope annual report of 2022. And I'm looking forward to see you all there again.